Hi, everybody. My name is Rick Ochs. Thanks for joining us here at the Apps on Cloud Summit. We're here with Quinn. He is the chief economist, cloud economist at the Duckbill group. And my name is Rick. I'm the principal product manager here at Turbo over our cloud product. And we're here to talk about digitally transforming cloud silos with culture change. And really, we're here to talk about how infrastructure organizations and application organizations are going through this transformation together. So Corey, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I am the chief cloud economist at the Duckbill group, where we fix the horrifying AWS bill, a small problem that comes to everyone in the fullness of time as long as you're an AWS customer. My total addressable market is ever growing and infinite, as it would seem. People are generally more familiar with my snark on Twitter, my last week in AWS newsletter, and a couple of podcasts, Screaming in the Cloud, and of course, the AWS Morning Brief. I'm mostly here because everyone else said no, and they wanted someone to have conversations with them about how to construe the relationships evolving between application teams and IT operations teams, often called engineering teams, how they think about themselves, and how to drive cultural transformation. It's fun because people want me to drive transformation as an external consultant, and let's be very clear, if I knew how to do that, I would be in a very different business. I believe cultural transformation has to come from within, usually from on high rather than bottom up. But there are things you can do to make it easier, which is where we begin.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. Yeah, so a lot of times as we're talking to some of our customers or prospects, we have these conversations with infrastructure organizations because they have strong desires to either manage application performance and or kind of get a grapple on their cloud infrastructure. And so we have these conversations that end up sort of maybe needing to rope in the application teams. And they may or may not be willing participants generally when it comes to things like sizing or taking actions or whatnot. And this adversarial nature between application teams and operation teams can sometimes really slow down transformation and kind of maybe even hinder or get in the way of using some of this new cloud technology to innovate in those sorts of ways. How do you see that, and how do you see the future of our industry approaching these problems?
I think this is a problem that you'll see at almost any scale. You're going to always find that the boundary of someone's visibility is what they tend to deem strategically important. If you ask an engineer what the thing that is most important to the company is next, the answer is always going to be engineering. If you talk to someone in accounting, they're going to say, oh, there's an accounting thing that is the most strategically important thing. Marketing is going to be talking about things that marketing cares about, and so on and so forth. And it's not that people show up intending to be adversarial. It's that they have radically different views of the business and radically different views of the world. And very often incentives misalign, where you wind up evaluating engineers on how many features they launch. An engineer takes a few weeks off to start doing an optimization pass and blows an obscene amount of money off of the recurring bill, and then they get penalized on their review because, you should have shipped another feature instead of doing this thing that we aren't incentivizing or even measuring. And it becomes a common story. Now, having silos between organizations, you always are going to have to wind up bringing other folks in. There's always someone who wrote the code who, at least in theory, understands the code. Spoiler, we don't. But, or at least has better insight into a problem than the person currently tasked with trying to solve that. And we want to increase that. We don't want to try and put people into this world where they have to have the state of everything going on in their application environment in their head. We're designed to collaborate. That's why we, at least theoretically, went towards microservices. So you didn't have 5,000 engineers clobbering each other on the same repo. Because again, the collective noun for a group of developers is, of course, a merge conflict.
That's awesome. So a lot of times we have the adversarial nature of infrastructure organizations trying to sort of limit application teams to not use massive amounts of hardware, but then the application teams that are much more focused in on, we need these applications to perform well, right? Because the application is sort of their baby, it's their child that they must maintain and manage. How do we get these organizations to sort of come to a kumbaya moment where they both agree and IT all up agrees that the primary business value is that these applications are serving a business need. They're serving, like, how do we get the infrastructure organizations to up level from patching, maintenance, and management of resources to applications, business value, technology as a service to their business?
On some level, you have to wind up socializing this in a very different way. I mean, I joke that most of our business on our end has been marriage counseling between engineering and finance. They speak about the same things in very different ways. functionally, we find that the people best suited to really bridge that divide is whoever has P&L responsibility for the line of business. Who does the budget sit with? Because they're going to at least theoretically have visibility into both sides and hopefully the contextual awareness of what's going on in the business in order for this to make sense. If you wind up telling an infrastructure operations team to lower the bill at all costs and that's the only concern, great, we're going to just turn everything off. And you'll be amazed at what that does to the bill, also to the company. So that's probably not something that most companies are going to want to embrace. Whereas there's also the question of, well, how do you wind up optimizing things? Because if you throw too much at an application, well, functionally in terms of resourcing, and by resourcing I do not mean people, then your failure mode is you've spent a little bit too much money. Whereas if you try and over optimize, then now you're dropping customer traffic on the floor. And give the company a choice between those two things, they're going to throw more resources at things every time.
Absolutely.
When you have developers that are starting out, like, okay, we're going to start on this size instance because it feels right and we'll adjust later. They're never going to adjust later on their own. That's what we built on. And, oh, okay, if we're using C5 larges and we need a bunch of those, we're going to continue to scale horizontally. Or if not, because it's overpowered, they're going to start taking shortcuts in some respects. I'm a personal fan of starting on something small that is constrained and I start smacking into resource limits and then graduate to something larger. That doesn't always work in every circumstance, but for my own approach, it keeps me from getting too terribly sloppy on writing code that just decides to make up for my shortcomings as a programmer with CPU power. Now, the counterpoint to that, of course, cloud resources are always less expensive than the person working on those in almost every case. I mean, don't take that as a personal challenge if you're an engineer and listening to this. But functionally, yeah, you can. It is easy for us to go out and get more cloud resources. It is harder for us to go out and get more engineers.
Absolutely. And the engineering cost of having an efficient application is usually not evaluated when you scope in engineering resources or features. That's a problem that we face daily just in the engineering organization, right? You don't scope out scalability all the time when you're looking at a feature, right? So another question I have is, as organizations continue to decentralize and IT becomes more of a self-service DevOps type model, and these organizations are maybe sort of gaining control over their own destiny and a lot of their application future and especially technology decisions on cloud, maybe what PaaS services they use and things like that. As these organizations continue to break apart into smaller groups, do you see this ability for apps and ops teams as they begin to sort of merge into DevOps and things like that to really have significantly more business focused conversations instead of always talking about infrastructure, but more talking about why is the app here? What does it do? What value does it have for our company? And how can we use technology to impact the bottom line of the company?
On some level, I hope so. In practice, though, I think that you also want to bound that on some level, because this was always my failure mode as a terrible employee, where I was always interested in the far bigger picture than the small corner of the enterprise that I was tasked to work on. And past a certain point, that's great. I'm sitting there lying awake at night worrying about things I can't necessarily control. And that doesn't lead to a terrific outcome in most cases either. So you want to give people enough context to do their jobs, but not so much that they're effectively feeling almost compelled to deviate from the lane that they're in and go somewhere else.
So, so building into cultural transformation into DevOps, having some sort of strategic initiative or goal setting effort to really make it clear what business value we're trying to achieve as part of our regular engineering kind of ROB, rhythm of the business, right?
Yeah, I've never regretted giving people more insight into we're building this application because it's used to charge people appropriate amounts for widgets. And if it turns out that we can support marketing's experiments to A/B test different pricing points and people will buy as many widgets if we raise the price, well, we make more money. It improves our margins. And let's have a small conversation about what margin is, both gross margin and net margin. And one of the things we do here with our staff is we have almost a intro to finance style course as part of our all hands, just because getting insight and visibility into what the business is doing and why it matters helps people make more informed decisions. Now, at some point, that does, as I mentioned, have a bit of a negative effect, because if you have someone who's focusing on the consulting side and then there's this media thing that's going on, like, well, what can I do to support that? Very little. In many cases, you're on the consulting side. It makes sense to focus on that. But that's a problem that I prefer having rather than someone who is completely oblivious to the larger machinations of the company. And when there's something else in flight that necessitates an all hands on deck effort in other parts of the business, I don't want them wondering why they weren't included. I don't want them wondering why no one is around to help them. And again, we're a small business, but this pattern magnifies and multiplies 100 different ways as the organization continues to grow and scale. Remember, most of our customers are big E enterprise style. Everything is complicated. No one wakes up in the morning hoping to do a bad thing today, unless presumably they work in Facebook's ethics department. The rest of us are trying to do the best we can with the knowledge we have and the resources we're granted.
Yeah, I've also seen quality improvements come down when engineers have direct understanding of the impact of the code they write, and they have an understanding not just of the impact, but who the users are and what it means for their company. If the company is innovating on technology, whether that's all of the new cloud startups that have just changed the face of the planet, whether it's your Netflixes or your Facebooks or what have you, it's really a situation where when developers have a deep understanding of not just their customer, but what it is they're trying to achieve with the code they're writing, instead of individual tasks like test this button or build this widget, it can really get engineers closer to the end value. It has morale implications. It has code quality implications. It reminds me of a time earlier on in my career when I was working in a build engineering role, and I was building an application for 3.5 years, daily builds, writing build scripts and everything. And I never knew what it was until one time after I'd moved on to another role. I was at a pretty big conference and there was a huge booth for this application. And I'm like, oh, that was the application I used to build. So I went up and I'm like, what does this app do? And they're like, oh, this is the number one primary revenue driving application for all of our sales force. And I was like, oh, and I had spent 3.5 years of my career building something. I had no idea what it did.
Well, in
And
fairness, was that never just, it was never advertised to you, or you never went looking until 3.5 years in?
a little bit of both, but when you're in an IT silo, it's not necessarily a natural thing to go and say, hey, what are we actually doing here, right? Like it may be, especially maybe when you're a little bit earlier in your career, it's not something that naturally populates. I hope that changes with the DevOps movement and engineering getting closer to business value. That's my intent.
In some companies, sure. In others, it was one of the most surreal experiences of my career, even to this day. Many years ago, I was a traveling trainer for a software company, and I spent 3 days a week at various companies teaching folks how to use the product. And I'm used to people being a little cagey. And I asked one group at a company, so what are you folks working on? And sometimes they'll tell me, sometimes they won't. But in this particular instance, not only would they not tell me, they wouldn't tell each other. And that was the strangest thing from my perspective. This idea of secrecy at all costs versus breaking down silos and letting people understand that, well, what you do impacts this person across the room because they're trying to service a third person who winds up being sitting in this other part of the room. And in many cases, they were directly impacting each other's work and had no idea that that was the case.
And that
At
can be
some point,
really,
secrecy is important. Don't get me wrong. Confidentiality is always important.
yeah.
But I have this, I guess, somewhat idealistic and naive perspective that if our email addresses all end in the same domain, that we're at least putatively on the same side.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really that cultural understanding of an organization that we're all working together here. We're all serving the end user. We're all serving the bottom line of the company. Of course, we want our companies to be profitable. We want our users to be delighted, to have a wonderful experience, to have value out of what our company provides for them. And if we can all get on that same page, whether that's engineering being more closely aligned to that end user and the infrastructure and traditional IT organization being more closely aligned to the application teams, we can all come to this agreement that we're here to build these apps, serve our customers, and deliver some pretty kick-ass software, right? And that really can create some common ground where we can stop arguing about the application team wanting 72 cores for every single VM and start arguing for the customer and advocating for value.
Oh, yeah. And people never communicate internally, too. Some of the more interesting discussions I have with prospective clients is I'll be brought in by the CFO. Great. So what's the situation? Why do you care about lowering the cloud bill? It's always a great place to start. It sounds like a dumb question. I assure you it is not. And their response is generally something along the lines of, look, I told my team that we should optimize. They say, we're optimized. Things are great. But the bill keeps going up and up and up. And I finally said, look, until we hit certain revenue targets, you're not allowed to spend more on cloud resources. And that afternoon, they blew $50,000 a day off of the bill. And now I'm at a loss here. What's going on over there? As a CFO, I'm scared to death. Do I just start giving random demands and throwing numbers at them that I pull out of a hat? Because at some point, I know as a CFO that's going to cause serious problems, but I don't know what the story is over there, and they're not communicating with me in a language I understand. And take the AWS bill as a great example. It shows up every month, in theory, saying you're spending this much on EC2, this much on S3, and so on and so forth. Yeah, the business doesn't care about that. How much are you spending on the data science team's mad scientist projects? How much are you spending on the billing system? And of course, everyone loves to talk about legacy, which is the engineering condescending term for it makes money. When, oh, what does that ancient piece of crap do? It's, oh, about 3/4 of our company's revenue. So how about you show a little respect? If it makes money, it's suddenly load bearing, and you have to treat it with a little bit of respect tied to it. It all comes down to context. And I think that as humans, when we don't have context, we tend to make assumptions that may or may not benefit the various parties involved.
Yeah, and I think having a deep understanding, not necessarily of, oh, we just need to lower our spending, but let's make sure our spending lines up to what our company wants strategically.
And
Where are
it's
we
not
spending
always, it's not
money?
even always lowering it. It's always fun to look at an environment where, okay, well, okay, that's you have this in one zone, infrequent access. You have this in S3's one zone. Great. What about one zone? Or yeah, let me try that a third time. Great. Computer terms. It's always fun. You have this data that lives in an infrequent access bucket. What about one zone? Oh no, if we lose that data, the company's gone. Cool. Is it being backed up? No. Is it have version control? No. Is MFA delete turned on? No. And this will destroy the company if it's gone. Yeah. How about you spend more and back it up somewhere? Because let me spoil it to you, whether AWS irreparably loses an availability zone or not, you're orders of magnitude likelier to accidentally fat finger a bucket command or delete the wrong stuff, either accidentally or maliciously. You kind of want that to be backed up. So it's, hey, why don't you try spending more on this thing? It comes down to
Absolutely.
context and understanding. It's not about golfing all the money off of a bill. It's about making sure you're spending the right amounts where they should be spent.
Yeah, one of my favorite ways that one of my coworkers says that is, if you want to lower your bill, no problem. We'll just size you to the T2 family, the T2 micro for literally everything, and we'll wash our hands and walk away, and you are optimized.
And
You'll
even that
also
doesn't
go
always
bankrupt,
work.
right? You'll go bankrupt because all your apps will fall over and your customers will all fire you, but you'll be optimized, and it
T2
really,
Unlimited mode will fix that problem. It just costs a lot more along the
yeah,
way. So what if
right.
we actually get, there's always nuance to these things.
There is. But it's interesting because there's products out there that claim optimization, and there's a lot of noise in the industry on optimization in general. But really application performance and management of application health and prioritizing them as our main vehicle for transformation and customer satisfaction is really the value our companies are providing.
Yeah.
And so this optimization, we're really trying to kind of pivot it a little bit and start talking about applications instead of just talking about optimization, which maybe is less of a strategic investment for a company that's trying to achieve higher value,
Well, let's
right?
talk about Kubernetes because that actually blends the two super well. From a cloud perspective, the provider's perspective, you have one application, Kubernetes, and it does some really weird things. It crosstalks among itself constantly. It scales things up. It scales things down, ideally. But you have no visibility as a cloud provider into what that application is doing. So from that lens, sorry, we are all application operations people now.
Right, absolutely. And the myriad challenges that that brings with it is managing those Kubernetes environments, especially when you have different competing business priorities as well, right? That expertise must come through in the application teams and how we manage those Kubernetes environments. Otherwise, we have development Kubernetes environments that are treated with the same amount of investment and expertise and supportability as the production ones. Um,
It comes down to also, I think this is an underappreciated sentiment, that it's more psychology than it is math. Look, I can sit down and tell you should buy a bunch of RIs or savings plans or whatever it is that makes sense in your environment, and you'll say, okay, that makes sense. And then here's the button to add it to your cart and make the purchase, and it's $25 million. Let me spoil this for you. You're probably not going to just click the buy button and get on with your day. Even though mathematically you should, it turns out that most of us have a bit of reluctance to click a yes button on something that is more money than we're likely to make in our entire career. And so you hold off and you don't do it, even though you're absolutely going to be spending that money either way. So you may as well do it at a discount. But there's a fear factor that goes into it. And
absolutely.
we see that with auto scaling and right sizing and the rest. And I have a laundry list of reasons why a lot of the tools in this space are not optimal from a purist perspective, but they'll take over for humans in many cases. And even if it's not optimal, it's better than what people are going to be doing on their own.
Yeah.
Even the basic low-hanging fruit, let alone the more complicated stuff. So the more along those lines that you're able to automate, the better the outcomes are going to be, because let's face it, no one wants a recurring task to go and make the terrifying purchase every month. They want something to automate that and smooth it out. And bonus points if you can dial it in with some form of guarantee of, oh, if we get it wrong, we'll reimburse you the difference. But it's easier to get people off of the fence and into making a decision if you don't ask them to make the decision, other than to hand aspects of that over to something that's automated.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's an underappreciated area.
It
Again,
is.
people think I'm
And
down on all the cost optimization tools. I'm not. I can talk theoretically about why they're wrong. I can talk about a bunch of other problems, but realistically, in many cases, it's better than doing nothing at all.
yeah, it's interesting because one of the biggest challenges we end up having is that trust conversation. It's where taking action and scaling and being elastic in cloud can deliver so much business value. It's just tremendous amounts of value. It's just this approach, and maybe the cultural IT focus in on five nines. You know, if something's not broken, don't touch it, right? And so you have this IT culture where people are like, you know, we don't know if we reboot this machine and if it'll come back up because that power supply hasn't been cycled in 5 years, and so you just
Five
don't do
nines
it.
is a complete myth. Let me
It
just put that
absolutely,
out there now. You need to
absolutely.
have at least another nine of durability for everything underlying it. You are not going to achieve five nines in a single facility or single AZ. So you've absolutely got to plan for it. And then you take a look at the actual business requirement of five nines. It's, do you actually need this? No, in many cases you don't. Certainly not if the investment cost is going to take to even come close to that.
Yeah.
So, oh, we can never go down. No downtime is acceptable. Is
But
also not
but Corey,
realistic.
we've been reading about five nines on our Twitter feed for the last 10 years. How
And how many of
come?
us
You
have
know?
actually gotten there? And how many
Yeah,
of
very
those slower
few.
conversations on Twitter are driven by companies who are offering uptime products and durability products and monitoring products? Now, let me be clear. The first time your cost optimization efforts cause an outage, you're not allowed to save money anymore. Let me just tell you that one from personal
Absolutely.
experience. So you've got to be
Absolutely.
cautious. And that also scares people away from tooling of, wait, I'm giving this thing access to do what in theory?
Yeah.
Yeah, but also no. And
And that's
integrating it into your existing workflows and
but
processes
that's the
matters.
same reason why the focus in on applications is far more important than the optimization problem, where if we turn this on its head, if we look at it from a different angle and say that applications are the lifeblood of our organization, and we're not a cost
That
optimization,
sounds like something the applications team is going to say.
well that's why there's this bridging relationship that is so critical, because we have to get the infrastructure orgs and the app teams to recognize they have the same goal. Their underlying goal is for these applications to work well, not just be engineered well, but to run well, to serve their customers well, to use new technologies, cloud technologies, to continue their innovation paths. um, that's why the optimization problem statement, you know, it struggles to gain trust. You're really not going to do well with an application team if you come in and say we want to lower your bill, and it's actually not the end result we're going for. The end result we're going for is to make sure these applications serve the business needs that exist.
Right. It's easy to think, what do we care about software for? Our company makes and sells underpants. Yeah, and from a certain perspective, you're absolutely right. But how does it market those underpants to people? How does it fulfill orders? How does it take orders? I assure you, they're not coming in via fax machine too often anymore. It's not your retail store, especially in a pandemic environment. Is it retail? Is it wholesale? How are those relationships managed? How are communications with third parties involved? How do you talk to your merchant bank going back and forth to validate that you are in fact charging people appropriately, controlling for fraud, etc.? It turns out that even a relatively old world blue chip style company that does things with ancient business models that our great grandparents might have understood as sell a thing for more than it costs to make that thing, which the VCs all turn up their nose at, it's still like that is how the world works. It is the kind of business that powers all of the rest of this. And explain to those people that they're not wrong. That is, in fact, what their company does. But it is empowered by a lot of these applications, and those applications have the
Yeah,
potential to have a disproportionate level of impact to the rest of what your company does.
it's really well
That
said.
is, in many cases, being
Yeah,
poorly communicated,
and
especially,
and
let's be frank, by technical people. We are
and
not often not our best advocates for what we do, how we do it, and how we see the world, because we assume everyone sees things similarly, and they just don't.
yeah, that's very well said. So I just want to reiterate that point too, where it's like all of these organizations, all of these companies are becoming computer and software companies because they're using these applications to do order fulfillment and billing and finance controls and and payroll. Even everybody has digital payroll now, whether it's a SaaS service through ADP or whatever, right? You have essentially textile companies, car manufacturing companies, all of these different industries and verticals, they're all becoming technology companies. And that sort of puts this emphasis on the applications that is core to how we deliver the added value, software value, technology value, cloud value to these organizations.
There's so much that can be yet unlocked. And again, that we keep seeing from Gartner and the rest that only a small portion of the current percentage of IT spend is moved to the cloud. So it's a boundless opportunity. What gets lost is that pie, the percentage slice of it, is rapidly expanding too. A lot of this stuff is net new. Like we see the bickering between cloud providers. We've stolen a marquee customer from the other one. Great. But we look at the meteoric growth numbers. That's not because you wind up stealing customers from other folks. And it's not just because engineers forget to turn things off. That's only part of it. And a lot of it is coming from net new growth, expansion, building new things, building new capabilities. And you talk to most companies, even the ones that are looking to fix their bill and do it effectively, they're still coming at this from the perspective of we absolutely want to make sure that we're doing things correctly, but it's a bright future. No one's panicking about the dollars and cents in most cases.
Right, right. And the ability to manage and keep these applications as that center point and main focus, and just maybe not spend your entire yearly budget in the first month while doing so.
Yeah. So we started off saying that we're talking about how to bring teams together, and I think that's an important lens to look at this through. Exposing transparency, exposing different aspects of what the company is going to be doing is my approach. How have you seen it work? What can we leave people with that's actionable and helpful?
Yeah, it's really about that agreement. It's what ends up happening is if we talk to the infrastructure organization, we start having these conversations about how we can protect application health, and they might not directly have an understanding of the applications that are maybe most important to their organization. And so bringing the application people into the conversation where we can have maybe a conversation, multidimensional conversation where the app teams can share what their concerns are. And they can say, we really need to make sure these applications are healthy and we're not really interested in downsizing or optimizing. And we can say, no. What we're trying to do here is manage and maintain that environment and get the IT and infrastructure organization to agree with those statements and really start saying, oh, okay, let's be more transparent and honest with our goals. We don't want to blow through our budget, but it is our job to provide the infrastructure to your application teams at the same time. So if we get them to start agreeing with each other on a call live, or if we start talking about maybe high-level strategies for how we go about optimizing, which is application performance first, it is application health first, then that's really the care and feeding of these applications as the primary business value. Then all of a sudden the energy sort of comes out of the room. It's no longer adversarial. It can be like, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense. I understand that. And that's how we sort of get down the path of building trust. Because again, automation is scary. Taking actions is scary. Scaling workloads is really scary. And in order for the progress to be made and for us to kind of start and dip our toe in the water on that first set of actions that we encourage people to take, it really is we all agree applications are the most important thing in our IT organization. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how, right? Now that we agreed on the strategy.
I think that's a great way to do it. I think that it comes down to forcing people to talk to each other other than through via tickets or via budget reconciliation also helps. It humanizes other departments. I mean, it's easy to look at collective large groups and assume ill intent, but when you're sitting down in the same room as someone, remember we used to be able to sit in the same room as people, then it becomes a radically different experience and you start to have, it's easier to develop a sense of empathy and thus appreciation for the other person's perspective.
Yeah, instead of getting a ticket that says provision 16 machines with 72 cores and 128 gigs of RAM for our back office app.
We just need
Right.
this thing to be able to run for this reason.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
So thanks
Well,
for
Corey,
having me
thank
here.
you.
I really appreciate it. It's always a great pleasure to hear the ongoing love affair of I have my own voice made large.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation, and thank you so much for joining our summit. And we're really excited to continue having these conversations in the future. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And if you want to hear more of my nonsense, there's always lastweekinaws.com or duckbillgroup.com, depending upon your point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you, Corey.